The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine gardens of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla made her way through the ornate corridors, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floors. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in these recent months, and today would prove to be no exception. Sarah Mitchell had been stationed at the castle for 7 years, her unwavering dedication and sharp instincts making her one of the most trusted members of the Royal Protection Unit. At 32, she possessed a rare combination of tactical expertise and genuine compassion that had earned her the respect of both her colleagues and the royal family members she protected. Her brown eyes held a warmth that belied her serious profession, and her shoulder-length auburn hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail that never seemed to have a strand out of place. The tension had been building for weeks now, ever since the incident at the charity gala. Sarah had been assigned to Queen Camilla's personal security detail that evening, a responsibility she had handled countless times before without incident. The event was meant to be a celebration of the Queen's patronage of various children's charities, a cause close to her heart that she had championed for decades. Everything had gone according to plan until the moment when a young journalist, barely out of university, had approached the Queen with what seemed like innocent questions about her upcoming initiatives. Sarah had positioned herself strategically nearby, her trained eyes scanning the crowd while keeping one ear tuned to the conversation. Something in the journalist's demeanor had triggered her instincts, the way his hands trembled slightly, the beads of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and, most tellingly, the way his eyes kept darting toward the exit. When the young man suddenly lunged forward with what appeared to be a concealed recording device, attempting to get uncomfortably close to the Queen while shouting accusations about royal spending, Sarah had reacted with lightning speed. In one fluid motion, she had stepped between them, firmly but carefully restraining the journalist while ensuring the Queen's safety. The entire incident had lasted mere seconds, but those seconds would prove to have far-reaching consequences. The Queen had been visibly shaken by the encounter, though she had maintained her composure admirably in front of the gathered guests and media. Sarah had handled the situation with textbook precision, following all protocols while ensuring no one was harmed. The journalist was quietly escorted away, and the event continued as if nothing had happened. By all accounts, Sarah had done exactly what she was trained to do, protect the royal family member under her care. However, in the days that followed, whispers began to circulate within the palace walls. Some suggested that Sarah's intervention had been too forceful, that the situation could have been handled with more discretion. Others argued that she had potentially embarrassed the Queen by drawing attention to what might have been resolved quietly. The truth was far more complex, rooted in the intricate web of palace politics and personal relationships that governed life within the royal household. Queen Camilla had always been acutely aware of her position's delicate nature. Having married into the royal family later in life, she had faced years of scrutiny and criticism from both the media and the public. Every action she took, every decision she made, was analyzed and dissected by countless observers. The incident at the charity gala, while minor in the grand scheme of things, had reopened old wounds and reignited discussions about her role and conduct. In the privacy of her chambers that night, Camilla had replayed the events over and over in her mind. She appreciated Sarah's quick thinking and professional response, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation had somehow reflected poorly on her ability to handle such matters with grace and authority. The young journalist's accusations, though unfounded, had touched on sensitive topics that she preferred to address through carefully planned initiatives rather than impromptu confrontations. The Queen's closest advisors had varying opinions on the matter. Some praised Sarah's swift action and emphasized the importance of maintaining strict security protocols. Others suggested that alternative approaches might have been more appropriate, given the relatively minor nature of the threat. These conflicting perspectives created an atmosphere of uncertainty that permeated the usual efficiency of the royal household. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's private secretary and one of her most trusted confidants, had been particularly vocal about her concerns. A woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and an impeccable sense of protocol, Lady Margaret had served the royal family for over 2 decades. She understood better than most the delicate balance required to maintain the monarchy's dignity while adapting to modern expectations and challenges. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret had said during one of their regular morning briefings, "while Miss Mitchell's intentions were undoubtedly admirable, we must consider the broader implications of such incidents. The media coverage, though minimal, has raised questions about our security procedures and, by extension, the perceived threats to your safety. The Queen had listened carefully to these concerns, weighing them against her own observations and experiences. Sarah had always been professional and respectful in their interactions, never overstepping boundaries or making the Queen feel uncomfortable in any way. If anything, her presence had provided a sense of security and confidence that allowed the Queen to engage more freely with the public during various engagements. But the pressure from within the palace continued to mount. Other members of the royal household began to question whether Sarah's approach aligned with the more subtle, diplomatic methods traditionally favored by the monarchy. There were suggestions that her background in military security might make her too direct, too willing to use physical intervention when more delicate solutions might be preferable. The breaking point came during a private meeting between the Queen and her security coordinator, Commander James Harrison. A distinguished man in his early 60s with graying temples and a bearing that spoke of years of military service, Harrison had been responsible for coordinating royal protection for the past 8 years. He had worked closely with Sarah and held her in high regard, making his next recommendation all the more difficult to deliver. "Ma'am, I believe we need to consider reassigning Miss Mitchell to a different role within the protection unit," Harrison had said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "While her performance has been exemplary, there are concerns about the compatibility of her methods with your specific requirements and preferences." The Queen had felt a knot form in her stomach as she processed these words. She knew that Harrison wouldn't make such a recommendation lightly, and she understood the various pressures that had led to this moment. Yet something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong to her. Sarah had done nothing but serve with distinction and dedication, and now she was being penalized for doing her job effectively. "What exactly are you suggesting, Commander?" the Queen had asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if Miss Mitchell were transferred to a different assignment, perhaps with one of the other family members or in a consulting role that would better utilize her skills while addressing the current concerns." The Queen had requested time to consider the recommendation, but she knew that delay would only prolong the inevitable. The forces aligned against Sarah's continued service on her detail were too strong, and the political considerations too complex to ignore indefinitely. That evening, as she walked through the castle's quiet corridors, the Queen found herself thinking about the nature of loyalty and justice. She had built her role around the principles of service and duty, but now she faced a situation where those very principles seemed to conflict with one another. Her duty to maintain harmony within the royal household was at odds with her instinct to stand by someone who had served her faithfully. The decision weighed heavily on her mind as she retired for the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring consequences that would ripple far beyond the immediate situation. Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her career and life were about to change dramatically, all because of a few seconds of professional excellence that had somehow been transformed into a liability. Meanwhile, in her modest apartment in London, Sarah was reviewing security protocols for the upcoming week's engagements, unaware of the discussions taking place about her future. She took pride in her work and genuinely cared about the people she protected, including Queen Camilla, whom she had come to respect deeply over their months of working together. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds of duty, loyalty, and justice within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. Neither the Queen nor Sarah could have predicted how profoundly this decision would affect not only their own lives but the very fabric of the institution they both served. As the night deepened and the castle settled into its familiar quiet rhythm, the weight of impending change hung heavy in the air. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about her place in the world, while forcing the Queen to confront the true cost of maintaining her position's delicate balance. The morning would arrive with its usual punctuality, but nothing else about the coming day would follow the predictable patterns that had governed life within the royal household. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not, and its effects would be felt far beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed countless dramas throughout their long history, but few had carried the emotional weight and personal stakes of what was about to unfold. In the quiet hours before dawn, as both women slept in their respective beds, neither could have imagined how profoundly their lives were about to intersect in ways that would challenge their understanding of duty, honor, and the true meaning of service. The morning arrived with unusual stillness, as if the very air within Windsor Castle held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Queen Camilla had barely slept, her mind churning with the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. The ornate clock on her nightstand chimed 7 times, marking the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most difficult days of her reign. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the castle at her usual time, 7:30 a.m. sharp, her uniform pressed to perfection and her equipment thoroughly checked. She had developed a routine over her years of service that helped her maintain the sharp focus required for her demanding role. A quick review of the day's schedule, a briefing with the overnight security team, and, then, positioning herself for the Queen's first official engagement of the day. But, today felt different from the moment she stepped through the castle's service entrance. The usual friendly nods from other staff members seemed more reserved, and conversations appeared to halt abruptly when she passed by. Sarah attributed it to the general stress that often accompanied particularly busy periods in the royal calendar, unaware that her own future had become the subject of intense discussion among the castle's senior staff. Commander Harrison had requested to see her in his office at 8:15 a.m., a meeting that seemed routine enough. Sarah made her way through the administrative wing of the castle, her footsteps echoing softly in the corridors lined with portraits of monarchs from centuries past. She knocked on Harrison's door with the confident bearing of someone who had nothing to hide and no reason to expect anything other than a standard briefing. "Come in, Sarah," Harrison's voice called from within, though there was something in his tone that immediately put her on alert. Years of training had taught her to read the subtle signs that others might miss, and every instinct she possessed was suddenly heightened. The office was exactly as she remembered it from her previous visits, walls lined with commendations and photographs documenting Harrison's distinguished career, a large wooden desk that had served multiple commanders before him, and windows that looked out onto the castle's inner courtyard. But, today, the atmosphere felt charged with intention that made the familiar space seem foreign. Harrison was not alone. Lady Margaret Thornfield sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, her expression carefully neutral but her posture rigid with the kind of formal bearing that suggested serious business. A third person, whom Sarah recognized as David Chun from the palace's Human Resources Department, sat nearby with a manila folder in his lap. "Please, sit down," Harrison gestured to the remaining empty chair, and Sarah complied while her mind raced to understand what could possibly require this level of formal procedure. In all her years of service, she had never been called to a meeting with this particular combination of officials. "Sarah," Harrison began, his voice heavy with what she now recognized as regret, "I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you reflects no judgment on your character or your professional capabilities. You have served with distinction, and your record speaks for itself." The words hit her like physical blows, each one confirming her growing suspicion that her world was about to change dramatically. She maintained her composure through sheer force of will, drawing on the same mental discipline that had carried her through years of training and countless high-pressure situations. However, Harrison continued, "Circumstances have arisen that require us to make some adjustments to our current assignments. Effective immediately, you are being transferred from Her Majesty Queen Camilla's personal protection detail to a new position within the General Security Division." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah felt as if the ground beneath her chair had suddenly disappeared, leaving her suspended in a moment of complete disorientation. She had dedicated herself completely to this role, had built her entire professional identity around the trust placed in her by the royal family, and now it was being stripped away without warning or clear explanation. "May I ask why?" she managed to say, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions raging within her. "Has there been a complaint about my performance? Have I failed to meet expectations in some way?" Lady Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression softening marginally as she spoke. "Miss Mitchell, this decision comes from the highest levels and reflects complex considerations that go beyond any individual performance metrics. The incident at the charity gala, while handled professionally, has raised concerns about the appropriate balance between security and discretion in Her Majesty's public engagements." Sarah felt a surge of disbelief and anger that she struggled to contain. "The incident where I protected Her Majesty from potential harm? Where I followed established protocols exactly as trained? I don't understand how doing my job correctly has somehow become a liability." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly struggling with his role in delivering this news. "Sarah, I want you to understand that I personally disagree with this decision. Your actions were textbook perfect, and any other member of this team would have responded in exactly the same way. But, there are political considerations and personal preferences that sometimes override purely operational concerns. The human resources representative, David Chen, finally spoke up, his voice professionally neutral. Miss Mitchell, you're being offered a position as a security consultant for special events, which actually represents a promotion in terms of salary and benefits. You would work with multiple members of the royal family and have opportunities to develop new protocols and training programs. Sarah felt the offer like a slap in the face disguised as a gift. They were trying to make her removal seem like advancement, wrapping her dismissal in the language of opportunity and growth. She could see through the euphemisms to the ugly truth beneath. She was being punished for doing her job too well, for prioritizing the Queen's safety over political considerations that she had never even been made aware of. Who made this decision? She asked directly, her military training allowing her to cut through the diplomatic language to the heart of the matter. I think I have the right to know who decided that my 7 years of dedicated service should be ended based on an incident where I performed exactly as expected. The uncomfortable silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. Lady Margaret's slight intake of breath, Harrison's inability to meet her eyes, and Chen's sudden focus on his paperwork all pointed to the same conclusion. This decision had come from Queen Camilla herself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The woman she had sworn to protect, whose safety she had considered more important than her own, had decided that Sarah was no longer suitable for that role. Every morning greeting, every professional interaction, every moment of mutual respect that Sarah had thought they shared suddenly took on a different meaning. I see, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her Majesty has made her wishes clear. Harrison finally looked directly at her, his eyes reflecting the genuine regret that his official capacity prevented him from expressing more openly. Sarah, I want you to know that this decision was not made lightly. There were extensive discussions, and your record was reviewed thoroughly. The Queen, she expressed personal regret about the necessity of this change. Personal regret. The phrase stung more than outright criticism might have. It suggested that the Queen saw this as an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice, collateral damage in the complex game of royal politics and public perception. Sarah had never wanted to be seen as a problem to be managed rather than a person whose dedication had earned some measure of loyalty in return. When does this transfer take effect? She asked, her professionalism finally reasserting itself over her emotional turmoil. Immediately, Chen replied, consulting his folder. You're to report to Commander Wesley in the Special Events Division tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Today, you'll be debriefed and will turn in any equipment specific to your current assignment. The finality of it took her breath away. 7 years of her life, gone in the space of a 20-minute meeting. No opportunity to say goodbye to colleagues who had become like family. No chance to demonstrate that the concerns about her methods were unfounded. No consideration for the possibility that the problem might lie not with her performance but with the unreasonable expectations being placed on it. As she left Harrison's office, Sarah felt as if she were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar corridors of the castle suddenly seemed foreign, no longer the workplace where she belonged but a place that was actively rejecting her presence. She could feel the eyes of other staff members on her as word of her transfer inevitably spread through the castle's efficient gossip network. In her small office in the security wing, Sarah began the mechanical process of gathering her personal belongings and preparing to hand over her equipment. Each item she packed felt like another small death, the photographs of her family that had motivated her during long shifts, the commendations that had marked milestones in her career, the small mementos that had made this sterile space feel like home. A soft knock on her door interrupted her packing. She looked up to see Detective Inspector Patricia Williams, one of her closest colleagues and someone who had often worked alongside her on the Queen's security detail. Patricia's expression was a mixture of sympathy and outrage that mirrored Sarah's own conflicted emotions. "This is complete bollocks, and everyone knows it," Patricia said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "You saved the Queen from what could have been a serious incident, and now you're being punished for it. The whole thing is backwards." Sarah managed a bitter smile. "Apparently, I was too aggressive in my response." Too military, not diplomatic enough for Her Majesty's refined sensibilities. That's rubbish, and, you know it, Patricia replied firmly. I've seen you handle dozens of similar situations with perfect judgment. If anything, you're one of the most measured officers on the team. This isn't about your performance, it's about politics and appearances, and that's what makes it so unfair. The validation from someone whose opinion she respected helped ease some of the sting, but it also made the injustice feel even more acute. If her colleagues could see the absurdity of this decision, why couldn't the people making it? Why was political expedience more important than rewarding competence and dedication? As Patricia left and Sarah continued packing, she found herself thinking about the Queen in a way she never had before. Instead of the dignified monarch she had served with pride, she now saw someone who was willing to sacrifice the people who served her best in order to maintain an image that might not even need protecting. The disappointment was almost overwhelming. The day stretched endlessly as Sarah completed the administrative requirements of her transfer. Forms to sign, equipment to return, briefings to attend that explained her new role in language that couldn't quite hide the fact that she was being sidelined. Through it all, she maintained the professional demeanor that had served her throughout her career, even as her heart broke a little more with each passing hour. As evening approached and her last day on the Queen's security detail neared its end, Sarah found herself standing in the courtyard where she had spent countless hours maintaining her vigilant watch. The familiar weight of responsibility that had defined her professional life was already lifting from her shoulders, leaving behind an emptiness that she wasn't sure how to fill. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and unfamiliar responsibilities, but tonight marked the end of a chapter in her life that had given her purpose and meaning for 7 years. The betrayal of that trust would take much longer to heal than the practical matters of her job transfer. In her private chambers, Queen Camilla was also reflecting on the day's events, though from a very different perspective. The decision to remove Sarah had not been made easily, and the weight of it had grown heavier with each passing hour. She wondered if she had made the right choice, or if she had allowed the pressures of her position to override her better judgment. The two women, now separated by more than just physical distance, both faced a sleepless night as they grappled with the consequences of decisions made and words left unspoken. Neither fully understood the impact their choices would have on the other, but both sensed that something important had been lost in the process. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet, but the tension that had erupted during the day continued to reverberate through its ancient halls, promising that the morning would bring new challenges and unexpected developments that would test everyone involved in ways they could not yet imagine. The news of Sarah Mitchell's sudden transfer spread through the castle like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in corridors and meaningful glances exchanged between staff members who had witnessed her exemplary service. By the third day after her removal from Queen Camilla's protection detail, what had begun as internal gossip had somehow leaked beyond the palace walls, creating a public relations nightmare that no one had anticipated. The first hint of trouble came when Harrison's assistant rushed into his office with a copy of that morning's tabloids. The headlines were sensational and damaging: Queen's Guard sacked after saving her life and royal ingratitude, hero officer punished for doing her job. The articles, though lacking in specific details due to palace privacy protocols, painted a picture of institutional callousness that threatened to undermine public confidence in the monarchy's treatment of its most dedicated servants. Queen Camilla learned of the media coverage during her morning briefing with Lady Margaret, whose usually composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern. The private secretary's voice was tight with barely controlled frustration as she read excerpts from the various newspaper accounts, each one more inflammatory than the last. "Ma'am, the situation has escalated beyond our worst projections," Lady Margaret reported, her fingers drumming nervously against her leather portfolio. "Social media is particularly volatile, with hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #RoyalHypocrisy trending across multiple platforms. The narrative being constructed suggests that you personally ordered the removal of a dedicated officer out of petty grievances rather than legitimate security concerns." The Queen felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she absorbed the implications. What had been intended as a discreet internal adjustment had somehow transformed into a public scandal that threatened to undermine years of careful work to rehabilitate her image with the British people. The irony was not lost on her that her attempt to avoid controversy had created a much larger one. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was experiencing the surreal reality of becoming an unwitting public figure. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke, with journalists from every major newspaper and television network seeking interviews and statements. Her small London apartment had become a battleground of competing media crews, each hoping to capture the first exclusive interview with the disgraced royal guard. The attention was overwhelming and deeply unwelcome. Sarah had built her career on discretion and professionalism, values that seemed incompatible with the circus atmosphere now surrounding her life. She had declined all interview requests and issued a brief statement through the police union expressing her continued respect for the royal family and her commitment to serving in whatever capacity was deemed appropriate. But the story had taken on a life of its own, fed by speculation and the public's fascination with perceived injustice within the monarchy. Former colleagues began speaking anonymously to reporters, sharing stories of Sarah's dedication and competence that made her transfer seem even more inexplicable. The narrative that emerged painted her as a devoted public servant who had been sacrificed on the altar of royal vanity and political expedience. The pressure was also mounting within the palace itself. Other members of the royal family had begun expressing concerns about the handling of the situation, with Prince William reportedly questioning the wisdom of the decision during a private family gathering. The Duke of Cambridge had always maintained good relationships with his security detail and was known for his loyalty to competent staff members. Commander Harrison found himself in an increasingly impossible position, caught between his professional obligations and his personal convictions. He had received several calls from senior officials in the Metropolitan Police, who were concerned about the precedent being set for the treatment of officers assigned to royal protection duties. The implication was clear: if dedicated service could be rewarded with sudden dismissal based on political considerations, it would become increasingly difficult to recruit and retain quality personnel. The breaking point came during a heated private meeting between Harrison and Lady Margaret, witnessed only by the Queen herself. The discussion, which was supposed to address damage control strategies, quickly devolved into a frank examination of the decision-making process that had led to this crisis. "With all due respect, Lady Margaret," Harrison said, his military bearing unable to completely mask his frustration, "this situation was entirely predictable and completely avoidable. Sarah Mitchell was one of our best officers, and removing her based on the concerns raised was always going to create more problems than it solved." Lady Margaret's response was sharp and defensive. "Commander, you seem to forget that decisions regarding Her Majesty's personal staff are ultimately her prerogative. The concerns about Miss Mitchell's methods were legitimate, and the Queen has every right to surround herself with personnel whose approach aligns with her preferences and the dignity of her office." "What concerns?" Harrison shot back, his composure finally cracking. "That she did her job too effectively? That she prioritized the Queen's safety over maintaining some abstract notion of diplomatic propriety? I've read every report, reviewed every incident, and I cannot find a single legitimate criticism of her performance." Queen Camilla, who had been listening to this exchange from behind her desk, felt the weight of both their arguments. She could see the logic in Harrison's position, but she also understood the complex political calculations that had influenced her decision. The problem was that those calculations now seemed short-sighted and potentially counterproductive. The situation grew even more complicated when several prominent figures began weighing in publicly. A retired general who had served as a security consultant to the royal family wrote an op-ed piece defending Sarah's actions and questioning the wisdom of prioritizing appearances over substance in security matters. A former Home Secretary made comments to the BBC suggesting that the royal family needed to better understand the challenging environment in which their protection officers operated. Most damaging of all was a carefully worded statement from the Police Federation, the organization representing rank-and-file officers throughout the United Kingdom. While avoiding direct criticism of the royal family, the statement expressed concern about the treatment of officers who perform their duties with distinction in service of the Crown and called for transparent and fair procedures in matters affecting the careers of dedicated public servants. Sarah herself remained largely silent throughout this media storm, but her restraint was beginning to crack under the constant pressure. Friends and family members were urging her to speak out, to defend herself against the implied criticisms that had led to her transfer. The narrative being constructed suggested that there must have been some failure on her part, some professional shortcoming that justified her removal from such a prestigious assignment. The emotional toll was enormous. Sarah had built her identity around her service to the crown, had sacrificed personal relationships and financial opportunities to dedicate herself to protecting the royal family. Now she found herself cast as either a victim of institutional cruelty or a problematic employee whose removal had been necessary but unfortunate. Neither characterization felt accurate or fair to her experience. The Queen, meanwhile, was struggling with her own emotional response to the unfolding crisis. She had not anticipated the intensity of public reaction, nor had she fully considered how her decision would affect Sarah personally. Reports from palace staff suggested that Sarah had been devastated by the transfer, not just professionally but personally, feeling betrayed by someone she had served with genuine loyalty and dedication. Late one evening, as Queen Camilla reviewed the latest batch of negative press coverage in the privacy of her study, she found herself questioning not just the practical wisdom of her decision but its moral foundation. Had she allowed the pressures of her position to override her better instincts? Had she sacrificed someone who deserved better treatment in order to satisfy concerns that now seemed trivial in comparison to the damage being done? The internal divisions within the palace were also becoming more apparent. Younger staff members, particularly those who had worked closely with Sarah, were expressing their disapproval through subtle forms of resistance, slower response times to requests, less enthusiastic participation in planning sessions, and a general atmosphere of reduced morale that was affecting the efficiency of daily operations. Prince Charles, though supportive of his wife, had begun expressing private concerns about the long-term implications of the situation. As someone who had spent decades building relationships with security personnel and palace staff, he understood the importance of maintaining trust and loyalty among the people who made royal life possible. The current crisis threatened to undermine those relationships in ways that could have lasting consequences. The media attention was also attracting unwanted scrutiny to other aspects of royal security arrangements. Questions were being raised about decision-making processes, accountability measures, and the treatment of staff members who served the royal family. What had begun as a single personnel decision was now threatening to expose broader institutional problems that the palace would have preferred to keep private. As the situation continued to deteriorate, it became increasingly clear that some form of resolution would be necessary. The status quo was unsustainable, both for the royal family's public image and for the individuals involved. But finding a solution that satisfied the various competing interests and concerns would require admitting that mistakes had been made, something that did not come easily to an institution built on tradition and the presumption of royal prerogative. Sarah Mitchell continued to report to her new assignment, performing her duties with the same professionalism that had always characterized her work. But the enthusiasm and sense of purpose that had once driven her were notably diminished. Colleagues in her new position observed a subtle change in her demeanor. She remained competent and reliable, but the spark that had made her exceptional seemed to have been extinguished. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would force all parties to examine their priorities and principles. The Queen would need to decide whether maintaining her original decision was worth the ongoing damage to her reputation and the morale of her staff. Sarah would have to determine how much of her dignity and self-respect she was willing to sacrifice to maintain her career in royal service. And the institution of the monarchy itself would face a test of its ability to adapt and acknowledge error when circumstances demanded it. The next phase of this crisis would prove even more challenging than what had come before, as private grievances transformed into public confrontations that neither side had wanted but both seemed powerless to avoid. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed many dramas throughout history, but few had combined personal betrayal, institutional politics, and public scrutiny in quite such a volatile mixture. The resolution, when it finally came, would satisfy no one completely but would teach everyone involved valuable lessons about the true cost of decisions made in the corridors of power. The question that remained was whether those lessons would be learned in time to prevent permanent damage to relationships and reputations that had taken years to build. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the media storm had begun, when Sarah Mitchell finally agreed to give her first and only interview to a respected BBC journalist known for her fair and thorough reporting. The decision had not been made lightly, but the constant speculation and mischaracterization of her situation had become unbearable. She felt that her silence was being interpreted as either guilt or weakness, neither of which accurately reflected her position. The interview, conducted in a neutral location away from both her home and the palace, was measured and dignified. Sarah spoke carefully about her years of service, her dedication to protecting the royal family, and her profound disappointment at how her career had been derailed by what she characterized as a misunderstanding of her role and responsibilities. She was careful not to criticize Queen Camilla directly, but her hurt and bewilderment were evident to anyone watching. "I gave 7 years of my life to serving the crown," Sarah said, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the pain she had endured. "I missed family gatherings, postponed personal relationships, and devoted myself completely to ensuring the safety of the people under my protection. To have that service questioned based on an incident where I performed exactly as trained feels like a betrayal of everything I believed about honor and loyalty." The interview was broadcast on the evening news and immediately amplified across social media platforms, generating an enormous public response. The comments sections of news websites were filled with expressions of support for Sarah and criticism of the royal family's handling of the situation. Opinion polls conducted in the days following showed a significant decline in public approval ratings for Queen Camilla, with many respondents expressing the view that she had treated a dedicated public servant unfairly. Within the palace, the reaction to the interview was swift and divided. Some advisors argued that Sarah had crossed a line by speaking publicly about internal palace matters, regardless of how diplomatically she had done so. Others recognized that her restrained and dignified approach had actually made the situation worse for the royal family, as it highlighted the contrast between her measured response and what appeared to be their callous treatment of her. Queen Camilla watched the interview alone in her private chambers, having requested that her staff give her time to process Sarah's words without the immediate pressure of strategic discussions about damage control. What she heard was not the bitter attack she might have expected, but rather the voice of someone who had genuinely loved her work and felt profoundly let down by people she had trusted and respected. The Queen found herself remembering specific interactions with Sarah over the months they had worked together. There had been countless small moments: Sarah's quiet professionalism during challenging public engagements, her thoughtful suggestions about security arrangements that balanced safety with accessibility, her genuine concern for the Queen's comfort and well-being. These memories sat uncomfortably alongside the decision to remove her from the position. The pressure for some form of response became overwhelming when several members of Parliament began calling for inquiries into the treatment of royal staff members. The situation had evolved from a personnel matter into a broader question about accountability and fairness within one of Britain's most important institutions. The monarchy's carefully cultivated image as a modern, compassionate organization was being seriously undermined. Prince Charles, who had initially supported his wife's decision out of loyalty, began having private conversations with her about the possibility of finding a way to address the situation constructively. He had his own relationships with long-serving staff members and understood how damaging this controversy could be to the palace's ability to attract and retain quality personnel in the future. "My darling," he said during one of their evening walks through the castle grounds, "I think we need to consider whether this situation has grown beyond what either of us anticipated. The damage to your reputation is significant, but, more importantly, we may have made a genuine error in judgment that deserves acknowledgement." The Queen had been wrestling with similar thoughts, but hearing them voiced by someone whose judgment she trusted completely made them impossible to ignore any longer. She had spent weeks defending her decision, both publicly and privately, but the mounting evidence suggested that the cure had been far worse than the disease. The turning point came when Commander Harrison submitted a formal report reviewing the entire incident and its aftermath. The document, written with careful attention to protocol and chain of command, nevertheless presented a devastating critique of the decision-making process that had led to Sarah's transfer. Harrison outlined the professional excellence of her service, the appropriateness of her response to the charity gala incident, and the damage that her removal had done to morale within the protection unit. Most significantly, Harrison included testimonials from other members of the royal family's security details, all of whom expressed concern about the precedent being set. The message was clear: if Sarah Mitchell could be removed for performing her duties correctly, then no member of the protection service could feel secure in their position. The long-term implications for royal security were potentially serious. Lady Margaret, who had been one of the strongest advocates for Sarah's removal, found herself increasingly isolated as the weight of evidence and opinion shifted against the original decision. During a particularly tense meeting with the Queen's senior advisors, she finally acknowledged that the situation had become untenable. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice reflecting a rare admission of uncertainty, "while I continue to believe that our original concerns had merit, it has become clear that the cost of maintaining our current position far exceeds any benefits. We need to find a way to resolve this situation that preserves your dignity while acknowledging that perhaps alternative approaches might have been more appropriate." The Queen appreciated Lady Margaret's diplomatic language, but she was no longer interested in euphemisms and face-saving formulations. She had come to understand that a real solution would require genuine acknowledgement of error and meaningful action to address the harm that had been done. The path forward became clearer after a private conversation between the Queen and Commander Harrison, during which she asked him directly what would be required to repair the damage and restore confidence within the protection unit. His answer was both simple and challenging. Sarah Mitchell needed to be offered her old position back, with a clear acknowledgement that her removal had been based on flawed reasoning. "Ma'am," Harrison said respectfully but firmly, "anything less than full restoration will be seen as inadequate by both the Protection Service and the public. Sarah's reputation has been damaged by this controversy, and only a complete vindication will repair that damage and send the right message about how the palace values loyal service." The Queen spent several days considering this recommendation, weighing the personal embarrassment of admitting error against the broader implications of allowing the current situation to continue. The decision was made easier by reports from her private secretary about the ongoing damage to her public standing and the increasingly vocal criticism from unexpected quarters. The resolution, when it finally came, was handled with the same attention to protocol and dignity that characterized all royal communications. Queen Camilla personally called Sarah Mitchell to request a private meeting, an unprecedented gesture that immediately signaled the seriousness of her intentions. The meeting took place in the Queen's private study at Windsor Castle, the same room where the decision to remove Sarah had been finalized weeks earlier. The atmosphere was formal but not cold, with both women understanding the gravity of the moment and the importance of handling it correctly. "Miss Mitchell," the Queen began, her voice carrying both authority and genuine regret, "I have asked you here because I believe that mistakes were made in the handling of your situation, mistakes for which I bear ultimate responsibility. Your service to the Crown has been exemplary, and your removal from my protection detail was based on concerns that, in retrospect, appear to have been misplaced." Sarah listened carefully to these words, her years of training helping her maintain composure while processing the enormous significance of what she was hearing. A personal apology from the Queen was virtually unprecedented, and she understood that this conversation would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The Queen continued, "I would like to offer you the opportunity to return to your previous position, if you are willing to do so. I want you to know that this offer comes with my full confidence in your abilities and my sincere regret for any distress this situation may have caused you personally." Sarah's response was measured and professional, reflecting both her relief at the vindication and her awareness that their working relationship would inevitably be changed by what had transpired. "Your Majesty, I am honored by your offer and grateful for your acknowledgement. I have never lost my commitment to serving the Crown, and I would be pleased to resume my duties with your protection detail." The public announcement of Sarah's reinstatement was carefully crafted to present the resolution as a demonstration of the royal family's commitment to fairness and their appreciation for dedicated service. The language avoided explicit admission of error while making it clear that Sarah's restoration was based on a recognition of her professional excellence and value to the institution. The media response was generally positive, with most commentators praising the Queen's willingness to reconsider her position and acknowledge the concerns that had been raised. Sarah's dignified handling of the entire situation, from her initial silence through her measured interview to her gracious acceptance of the Queen's offer, earned widespread respect and admiration. Within the palace, the resolution of the crisis was met with relief but also with a recognition that important lessons had been learned about decision-making processes and the treatment of staff. Commander Harrison implemented new procedures for handling concerns about personnel assignments, ensuring that future decisions would be based on comprehensive review and clear documentation rather than subjective impressions and political considerations. Sarah Mitchell returned to her duties with the same professionalism that had always characterized her service, but both she and Queen Camilla understood that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the experience. There was a new level of mutual respect based on having navigated a difficult situation together, but also an awareness that trust, once damaged, requires time and consistent behavior to fully repair. The incident became a case study within royal circles about the importance of careful consideration before making personnel decisions, particularly those involving long-serving and competent staff members. It also demonstrated the power of public opinion and media scrutiny to influence even the most traditional and insular institutions when questions of fairness and justice were involved. For Sarah, the experience had been painful but ultimately educational. She had learned important lessons about her own resilience and the value of maintaining dignity under pressure. Her reputation had not only been restored but actually enhanced by her handling of the crisis, and she found herself receiving offers from other security organizations impressed by her professionalism and character. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, had gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity of leadership and the importance of considering the human impact of administrative decisions. The experience had tested her judgment and forced her to confront the reality that even well-intentioned choices can have unintended consequences that extend far beyond their original scope. The resolution of the crisis marked the beginning of a new chapter for both women, one characterized by greater understanding of each other's perspectives and a renewed commitment to the values of service and dedication that had brought them together in the first place. The ancient institution of the monarchy had demonstrated its capacity for self-correction and adaptation, qualities that would serve it well in facing future challenges. In the years that followed, the incident would be remembered as a moment when the human dimension of royal service was brought into sharp focus, reminding everyone involved that behind the ceremony and protocol were real people whose lives and careers deserved careful consideration and respect. The lesson, once learned, would influence countless future decisions and help ensure that the monarchy remained an institution worthy of the dedication it demanded from those who served it.